When thousands of messages disappear following the death of a young actor, what is erased is not merely information, it is the collective right to remember. The morning this phenomenon began, the public did not imagine they were witnessing something much deeper than a simple digital glitch. The first messages attempting to say goodbye to Yu Menglong vanished with unsettling speed, as if the very surface of the networks had decided to close before emotion could take shape. That sudden absence, which at first seemed like an isolated incident, grew into an extended silence, so uniform and precise that it was impossible to attribute it to chance. It was a void that withdrew not only words, but also the possibility for memory to find a place to hold on. While the public tried to adapt to this strange stillness, the platforms displayed an artificial sheen, too polished for a moment of collective mourning. There was no trace of comments, no signs of shock, nor the usual mosaic of spontaneous emotions that usually accompanies the death of a public figure. What emerged instead was a carefully molded silence, a digital landscape in which every emotional gesture seemed destined to disappear before reaching anyone else. That simultaneous disappearance of voices began to awaken questions that no technical explanation could satisfy. Why did a farewell need to be surveilled? What kind of mechanism could justify the suppression of a gesture as elemental as remembering? Amidst this panorama, the tension between the natural impulse to say goodbye and the rigidity of the system administering the visibility of that farewell began to acquire crucial relevance. Yu Menglong's death, occurring under unexpected circumstances, had opened a crack, revealing deep tensions latent for a long time in the entertainment industry. Where there should have been a space for comfort, a structure arose capable of filtering not only data, but even the very possibility of feeling. The paradox was inevitable. While society tried to process sincere grief, a silent mechanism seemed determined to prevent memory from taking shape. This contrast, as abrupt as it was persistent, invited a closer look at the hidden gears regulating every nuance of public life. What began as a digital anomaly slowly transformed into a revealing indication of something much broader, a system that, in its attempt to preserve control and stability, ended up redefining the way the public understood loss, remembrance, and the emotional dignity of those forming part of the spectacle. But behind the glamour and the excuses, what mechanisms really drive this crisis? We will analyze every detail, from the initial errors to the irreversible damage, to see how the world of entertainment functions and how an icon is redefined. However, before understanding the dimension of the emotional collapse that followed his passing, it is necessary to return to that morning when the absence began to expand like a shadow. The news had barely found a space to settle when the digital surface acquired an artificial sheen, too polished, too immobile. There was no trace of the spontaneous torrents of emotion that usually accompany a public loss. What emerged, instead, was a disturbing stillness, a calm that did not correspond to the magnitude of the event. The first users thought of a habitual maladjustment, perhaps a technical failure due to the sudden increase in traffic. However, the systematic disappearance of messages, even those formulated with the strictest sobriety and respect, began to trace a pattern difficult to ignore. Words vanished before finding an echo, as if an invisible force withdrew them to prevent mourning from becoming a shared act. There were no warnings or moderation notes. No traces remained. only a void imposing itself with the precision of a mechanism designed to act without hesitation. In that suspended terrain, where emotion sought a channel that was denied to it, a sense of unreality began to settle in. Silence did not attenuate the sadness, it intensified it. It turned the farewell into a fragile, almost clandestine gesture, difficult to sustain against the neatness of the digital landscape. The disappearance of every message implied an additional rupture between the human impulse to express pain and the logic of a system administering every nuance of public life. Thus, Yu Menglong's death ceased to be an event limited to the private sphere, to transform into a mirror, revealing a deeper tension, that which confronts human vulnerability with structures that seem to fear even the most discreet trace of emotion. The impeccable surface that spread that morning was the beginning of a journey toward hidden strata of an industry that, in its attempt to preserve a perfect image, lifted a veil over what it meant to remember. In that initial crack, tiny but decisive, the true magnitude of a story, overflowing an actor's biography, was insinuated. It was the antechamber of a greater conflict, one that would force the public to interrogate not only the circumstances of a death, but also the value and fragility of memory in a carefully administered world. In the months prior to the tragedy, Yu Menglong's life unfolded in a territory where the serenity characterizing him began to become a weight difficult to sustain. His personal history, marked since childhood by the rigorous discipline of Jiangsu and the silent vastness of Xinjiang, had forged in him a temperament many defined as a stable light. That light, however, was not static. It was born of a habit acquired since childhood, the capacity to retreat inward when the outside world became too overwhelming. What initially seemed the natural balance would transform over time into a survival mechanism, articulated between the need to please and the fear of disturbing the harmony of a system demanding constant obedience. When he arrived for the first time at the studios, where the most visible figures of national entertainment were formed, his discreet presence caught attention without the need for elevated words. He observed, analyzed, learned. Every passage of the script was for him a way of understanding not only the character, but the emotional structure sustaining it. He adjusted the cadence of his silences as if the contained sound could express something dialogue failed to formulate. That level of thoroughness, uncommon in young actors who usually relied on the immediacy of talent, began to define him as a particular figure within the environment. Directors highlighted his ability to listen to directions as if they were fragile pieces, worthy of being polished, before turning them into a gesture. No one imagined that the same sensitivity illuminating his work would end up becoming the crack, confronting him with unbearable pressure. The professional environment in which he developed did not function as an open creative stage, but as a rigid architecture organized to maintain impeccable public stability. The contracts regulating his daily life were not limited to schedules and work obligations. They included provisions on his conduct, his image, his personal relationships, and even the intensity of his appearances in unofficial spaces. For a young man accustomed to introspection, the transition toward a space where spontaneity had to be contained meant an inner displacement difficult to name. Every day implied the gradual renunciation of small gestures of emotional freedom, A comment out of tone, a sincere opinion, a show of tiredness. Everything had to be administered. The wear and tear began to insinuate itself in details imperceptible to the public, but visible to those working closely with him. Stylists, accustomed to preparing actors subjected to exhaustive schedules, detected tiny marks around the neck and face, signs appearing after prolonged days or weeks of consecutive filming. They knew those marks spoke a different language, that of the body trying to adapt to a routine exceeding it. They asked no questions. In that sphere, silence was considered a virtue, a way to protect the continuity of the project and avoid unnecessary tensions. Thus, every sign remained recorded only in the intimate sphere of the team, a silent archive of an exhaustion, finding no outlet. In interviews where actors were expected to show a controlled version of themselves, Yu resorted to metaphors that at the time seemed simple poetic expressions. The phrase, "the light is heavy," was one of them. Many interpreted it as an aesthetic comment on the set lighting or the symbolic responsibility of being a public figure. Over time, that phrase would acquire a deeper meaning, revealing the way he perceived his own role, the need to maintain a constant luminosity, a carefully calibrated shine, even when the interior began to darken. He did not speak of the weight of fame, but of the weight of sustaining an image without fractures. The distance from his family increased, following that same pattern of accumulated silences. It was not disinterest or affective detachment, but the will to protect them from a scrutiny he knew was inevitable. Visits decreased, calls became briefer, always mediated by the worry that any spontaneous gesture would be misinterpreted or used to feed narratives alien to his reality. The sense of isolation grew not as a consequence of direct conflict, but as the result of a series of small decisions made with the intention of preserving harmony. That harmony, however, began to break from within. In the last months, emotional pressure reached a level where the discipline accompanying him throughout his life was no longer sufficient to sustain him. In the studio corridors, his way of walking seemed charged with a tense concentration, as if every movement were an attempt to contain a deep weariness, too intimate to be expressed. His colleagues noticed that after each recording cut, he remained silent a few seconds longer than usual, looking at an indeterminate point on the floor or adjusting a non-existent detail of his costume. It was not a distraction. It was an effort to recompose what was becoming disordered inside him. None dared to ask. The root of his wear and tear was not an isolated event, but the accumulation of tensions, rarely finding a legitimate space to manifest in a system privileging perfection over emotional honesty. The structure intending to offer stability ended up restricting his capacity to express fragility, transforming every day into a silent negotiation between what he felt and what he had to show. The public saw serenity. What they did not see was the price of keeping it intact. Understanding this turning point is essential, not only to reconstruct the last chapters of his life, but also to understand the echo his death generated. Yu Menglong's story exposes the fundamental conflict between an artist's humanity and a system demanding constancy, shine, and silence. In that dissonance, an invisible tension was brewed, accumulated over years, finally finding a limit impossible to surpass without devastating consequences. His tragedy is not solely that of an actor succumbing to exhaustion, but that of an environment incapable of offering spaces for vulnerability in a context perceiving it as a threat. Looking back, every fragment fits into an emotional landscape that had been there from the start, hidden between layers of professionalism and discipline. But his story, before being a tragedy, was a silent warning no one knew how to read. What do you think of this? Comment Amen below so we can continue with the unfinished stories. The news of Yu Menglong's passing spread with the abrupt speed characterizing events capable of altering the emotional surface of an entire country. Early in the morning, while users tried to understand the dimension of the event, digital platforms began to transform into a landscape stripped of any spontaneous trace. Where there should have been a natural flow of condolences, a void arose not corresponding to any technical logic. Every message attempting to pay tribute to the actor disappeared in seconds, as if a silent force were anticipating any gesture of mourning even before it found a recipient. What started as an isolated anomaly soon became a disturbing pattern. At first, many thought it was a temporary saturation due to the sudden increase in activity. Platforms had already shown vulnerability in extraordinary situations, and the idea of a momentary crash seemed plausible. However, the precision with which messages were eliminated began to defy that explanation. There were no visual errors, no maintenance notices, no signs of congestion. What existed was an instantaneous elimination, executed with the coldness of a protocol inscribed at a level invisible to users. Messages from public figures, even those formulated with extreme prudence, vanished with the same speed as posts from strangers. The lack of differentiation was so absolute that it hinted at an intention going beyond mere technical regulation. As the day advanced, the feeling of bewilderment turned into collective tension. Established actresses, recognized presenters, and content creators with immense audiences faced the same impossibility. No expression of condolence, however moderate, managed to remain visible. The disappearance of every message not only frustrated the desire to say goodbye, but fueled a growing disquiet. Why was such an elemental act as expressing sadness being suppressed? That impossibility fueled the immediate division of the public. One sector interpreted the elimination as a necessary containment measure, destined to prevent harmful speculations from propagating in an extremely sensitive moment. They considered that protecting the actor's family from a whirlwind of rumors was an ethical responsibility. The other sector, however, perceived the situation as a systematic operation to control the narrative from its origin. According to this reading, the suppression of messages did not seek to preserve respect, but to prevent the actor's death from triggering a broader debate on the structural pressures of the industry. For them, the imposed silence was not an act of prudence, but a gesture of concealment. The fracture between these two approaches grew rapidly, and in that already tense climate, an event arose altering the panorama even more. Liu Wei, a recognized presenter, briefly published a screenshot of a conversation with Song Tse, a makeup artist and close friend of Yu Menglong. The phrase appearing in the message, "The world destroyed him," spread in a matter of minutes, generating an immediate emotional impact. However, the post disappeared with the same speed, followed by the complete disappearance of the account. The abrupt elimination did nothing but amplify the resonance of those words. Where there was a trace, now there was an even more disturbing void. Meanwhile, international platforms began to play an unexpected role. Users from other countries, aware of the volatility of the original content, started collecting and translating screenshots, isolated comments, and fragmentary testimonies that had managed to survive a few seconds longer before disappearing. Thus was born a kind of improvised archive, sustained by the collective urgency to preserve what seemed prohibited. Reddit, TikTok, and X became refuges where memory resisted spontaneously. What had been erased in one space reappeared multiplied in another, as if the elimination itself acted as an impulse for proliferation. Meanwhile, within the industry, the atmosphere became denser. Pre-recorded programs postponed their broadcast. Scheduled interviews were cancelled without justification. Those artists supposed to appear at public events opted to withdraw temporarily so as not to be exposed to erroneous interpretations. Communication agencies issued carefully drafted statements where caution was the central axis. No word should open a door that could put the narrative stability seeming to be imposed from a higher instance at risk. That uniformity in tone revealed the presence of a tacit agreement, sustaining a silence, protecting both the system and those depending on it. Foreign media, observing from a critical distance, began to analyze the phenomenon from broader perspectives. Some experts in cultural politics pointed out that the massive elimination of messages reflected a deep tension between the idealized image desired to be projected and the real complexity of media structures. In that reading, the silencing responded not only to the management of a delicate event, but to an attempt to prevent the tragedy from leading to questioning about mental health, work rhythm, and the restricted margin of autonomy characterizing artists within the system. For many observers, the fear seemed directed not toward information, but toward the emotional interpretation that information could trigger. For the public admiring Yu Menglong, this situation generated a mixture of powerlessness and pain. They knew the family needed privacy, but they also felt the urgency to preserve his memory in an environment appearing determined to erase it. That tension gave rise to symbolic gestures, images suggesting without naming, abstract phrases only those following the case could decipher, shared silences acting as a form of affective resistance. Those scattered islands of expression transformed into testimony of an emotional bond that could not be eliminated with the same ease as a message. The paradox was evident. The greater the attempt to suppress, the stronger the impulse to remember became. The tragedy ceased to be an isolated fact, to become the reflection of a broader question. What happens when a system attempts to administer not only information, but also the way people feel? What do you think of this? Comment Amen below so we can continue with the unfinished stories. The silence extending after the massive disappearance of messages did not produce the calm some expected. On the contrary, it generated an emotional density settling over all those who had followed Yu Menglong's trajectory with devotion. In the studios where he had worked, conversations began to dilute, replaced by cautious glances suggesting not only sadness, but also a latent fear of uttering words that could be interpreted as a deviation from the established framework. What was being lived was not simply the loss of an artist, but a suspension of memory in the hands of forces no one could name openly. With the passage of days, the actor's family adopted a respectful silence, a decision deepening the sensation of collective emptiness. Mourning unexpectedly shifted toward an uncertain territory, a space where every question had to be formulated with extreme prudence. The absence of confirmed information fed bewilderment and gave rise to a climate where any gesture could be misinterpreted, widening the emotional risk for those attempting to maintain a link with his memory. The tragedy seemed to slide toward a zone where the unspoken weighed more than any explicit declaration. When the environment reached that level of extreme containment, an event occurred, minimal in appearance but decisive in its effect. A brief video, recorded casually during a break in one of the actors' shooting sessions, began to circulate on an international platform. The clip showed Yu Menglong sitting next to a technical crew member, conversing with someone off camera. There was no drama, no staging, no words charged with symbolism. Just a simple instant. The serenity of his smile, warm, discreet, deeply human. That image, so far removed from the oppressive climate dominating the public account, spread with unexpected force. For users finding the video, the reaction was immediate. The naturalness of the scene produced a mixture of tenderness and revelation. There, in a few seconds, appeared a truth no elimination mechanism seemed capable of dissolving. The public, plunged for days in a sterile digital landscape, suddenly faced a form of authenticity completely escaping control structures. In a matter of hours, the clip crossed digital and cultural borders, reaching communities that, without knowing the actor's story in detail, recognized the humanity contained in that simple expression. The diffusion of the video provoked an unexpected change in collective perception. The tragedy ceased to be trapped in a framework of restrictions to transform into a broader reflection on the right to preserve what gives meaning to human existence. The actor's silent gesture, rescued from a personal archive without greater pretension, became the turning point, allowing the community to recover something absent from the beginning, the possibility of feeling without asking for permission. This emotional awakening gave way to a spontaneous movement within the industry. Some artists began publishing symbolic illustrations, visual compositions evoking the persistence of light, the difficulty of extinguishing an authentic emotion. Although these expressions avoided any direct reference to the case, those knowing the background immediately understood their meaning. They were signs of silent support, gestures allowing one to accompany the mourning without openly challenging the norms regulating public activity. That metaphorical language offered a bridge between the need to respect the institutional framework and the emotional impulse seeking to manifest itself in the community. The circulation of these gestures gave rise to a phenomenon some analysts termed expanded memory. The concept described the way the actor's memory extended through fragments escaping official frameworks, photographs saved by followers, comments translated from their original language, videos re-uploaded on anonymous accounts, details rescued from the personal archives of those who had worked with him. Memory, far from remaining confined by the initial restrictions, acquired an unexpected autonomy, multiplying in spaces where the system could not reach it. It was not an act of direct confrontation or open rebellion, but the silent expression of a deeply human impulse, preserving the dignity of a life that had touched thousands of people. As this movement expanded, a phenomenon emerged that users began to describe as silent presence. They did not refer to superstitions or mystical ideas, but to the sensation that the actor's memory continued influencing conversations, even when his name was not explicitly mentioned. In that new, emotional space, silence ceased to be absence and transformed into a territory where the public reconstructed the story from their own experience. Memory thus became an act of cultural resistance, a collective gesture, questioning the idea that a social narrative could be completely molded from a hierarchical structure. The expansion of this phenomenon introduced a deeper reflection on the limits of information control. Several specialists pointed out that the suppression of content can temporarily contain the diffusion of certain elements, but cannot prevent the absence itself from becoming a significant clue. The systematic elimination of messages, instead of extinguishing interest, intensified it until it became unstoppable. The will to reconstruct what was being withdrawn revealed the fragility of any system, pretending to administer not only data, but also the emotional impulse shaping collective memory. From that turning point, Yu Menglong's tragedy acquired a meaning transcending his biography. His story was no longer solely that of an actor whose life was enveloped in silent pressures, but that of a community discovering that the act of remembering constitutes an essential form of humanity. The light he had sustained for years, even with effort, now found an unexpected reflection in those refusing to let it be extinguished. Collective mourning, previously repressed, began to transform into a movement of emotional affirmation. The community, recognizing itself in the fragility revealed by the tragedy, understood that the right to feel and express that feeling forms part of the very essence of human experience. Memory, liberated from the limits imposed at the beginning, became a shared territory where emotional truth found its own path, immune to the disappearance of data on the surface. What do you think of this? Comment amen below so we can continue with the unfinished stories. The story that began with the silent disappearance of thousands of messages ended up revealing a dimension much deeper than the loss of a young actor. As the echo of events extended beyond digital borders, it became evident that Yu Menglong's tragedy had opened a fissure in the carefully administered surface of the entertainment industry. There, in that space where human emotion and control structures converge, his death acquired a meaning transcending his individual biography. The absence of data, the prolonged silence, and the persistence of expanded memory revealed the complex relationship between systems attempting to regulate public sensitivity and communities refusing to renounce their capacity to remember. That silent resistance was, in essence, the true turning point. Yu Menglong's memory did not remain confined to the limits imposed in the early days. On the contrary, it came to life in discrete gestures, in recovered videos, in words shared with caution, and in the collective determination of those refusing to allow a meaningful existence to disappear without a trace. In that process, the community rediscovered that remembering is not a passive act, but a conscious exercise, a way of affirming that human dignity does not depend solely on material permanence, but on the depth of the emotional bond, uniting a society with those who have marked their experience. Analysts following the evolution of the case coincided that the tragedy offered a crucial lesson on the limits of information control. A system can order the withdrawal of content and regulate its immediate circulation, but it cannot administer the emotional interpretation silence provokes. The deliberate absence of data becomes a signal driving the public to reconstruct the scattered fragments. And in that act, a truth emerges that can hardly be contained. The more a story is restricted, the greater the determination of those observing it to give it continuity. That dynamic reveals the fragility of any structure pretending to completely mold social perception. From this perspective, the figure of Yu Menglong began to transform into an unexpected symbol, the persistence of light in an environment where darkness seemed to impose itself as the norm. It also represented the certainty that emotional truth finds a way even when data disappears from the surface. For many, his story crystallized a broader debate on the need to protect spaces where emotions can be expressed without fear, where memory does not depend on external authorizations or institutional frameworks defining what can remain visible. The learning emerging from this experience is significant. Memory belongs to those feeling the need to grant meaning to their own experience, not to the structures attempting to administer it. Yu Menglong's tragedy reminds us that human vulnerability cannot be erased with the same ease as a message, because its value resides in the collective capacity to honor it, preserve it, and reinterpret it. The lesson transcends the realm of show business and extends to all spaces where public sensitivity meets the limits of control. In an era where visibility can be regulated, emotion persists as a natural impulse, resisting even the most rigid structures. Looking toward the future, open questions remain about the evolution of the relationship between the public and the systems administering information. Perhaps new forms of dialogue will emerge, granting greater transparency to those participating in highly regulated industries. Or perhaps this experience marks a turning point, driving digital communities to protect with greater resolve the spaces where emotions can find a legitimate channel. If you are interested in exploring another case where memory, silence, and human vulnerability intertwine in a similar way, I will be here to continue the conversation and accompany you in the direction you wish to follow.